Welcome to our next lecture, Colonial Worlds and Women's Lives, 1607 to 1750. This lecture follows now our initial lecture on the worlds of Native American and African women by looking at the settlement of North America, the English settlement of North America, and the subsequent arrival now of new populations of people, including European and African women, to the colonial settlements of North America. I will break this lecture into three different parts to try and keep each part rather manageable time-wise, maybe around 25 minutes or so. And we start with an empire born. And naturally, the figure who confronts us here, the central figure, the chief person, if you will, of historical influence and authority, is not a man, but a woman, arguably the most powerful monarch, or at least consequential monarch of her day, Elizabeth I of England. This remarkable painting by George Gower commemorates England's defeat of the Spanish Armada. And you can see just over her shoulder here out the window the ships that confronted the Spanish infamous Armada. You see over the other shoulder scenes of destruction as Spanish ships bathed in darkness. Note, English ships bathed in light, Spanish ships bathed in darkness here, colliding with the rocky coast of the English Isle. This was England's great moment now as it entered the global affairs of the age. By defeating the Spanish Navy, otherwise known as the Armada, Elizabeth really catapulted herself into a position now of great prominence moving forward, and more so even that of her country. So the scene depicts the Armada's defeat, while Elizabeth, in full regalia here, queenly regalia, lets her right hand rest on the globe, as if to suggest England's place now in the affairs of the world. You see over here in the corner a kind of mythic creature, a mermaid perhaps, that symbolized that England's future would be tied to her success as a maritime nation. Otherwise rather small, this island country, this island kingdom, was not considered at the time to be a great land power beyond her own borders of England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales, but as a maritime power she would come to rule the ocean seas. And it all really begins now with this moment in English history involving this titanic defeat, if you will, of the Spanish Armada. So yes, the regal presence of Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and her island nation, England. And what happens next are a series of moves by England to establish a growing influence beyond, again, her own boundaries, what we might call experiments in dominion. And note here, right from the start, for all the talk of America being established for freedom by modern Americans, it's worth noting that freedom had nothing to do with English motives regarding expansion, with English motives regarding the exploration and travel of oceans. Freedom played no real part, as we as modern Americans would understand it, but instead something called dominion did. And dominion is an important word here. It comes from the same root word as our word dominance or dominate, and it means to hold power over another, which England fully intended to do first by establishing its colonies, or what it called at the time its plantations, in Catholic Ireland. Under Elizabeth, England had become a mostly Protestant nation, that is, in the religious divide of the day between Protestantism and Catholicism of the Christian world. English Protestantism now asserted its dominance over the Irish Catholic. See here a map showing the relative position of England and Scotland as an island mass, a geographical mass adjacent to the Emerald Isle, that is adjacent to Ireland. And it was this assertion of English authority across the Irish Sea here, over the Catholic Irish, that would begin England's career, you might say, in its storied history as an empire. England's version of the Spanish Reconquista, that is, as the Spanish had driven the Moors off the Iberian Peninsula, now England will in effect seek to conquer land in the name of their God, to establish the English flag in foreign soils, beginning with Ireland. A famous drawing here showing an Irish lord by the name of O'Neill seemingly submitting to an English lord by the name of Mountjoy. But this was part now of a military dominion. As you can see in the background, these columns of troops represent English authority over the Irish. And even though Tyrone would famously rebel against English rule, in the end the English would defeat the rebellion and claim much of Ireland as a kind of colonial province. And this dominion was of course projected into the wider Atlantic world. The English are going to be a bit late to the party of conquest and colonization in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish, after all, beginning with Columbus, had been involved in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere now for a century prior to the arrival of the English, as had the Portuguese, and even the Dutch and the French had been rather busy in establishing commercial ties with the Western Hemisphere, whereas the English now arriving perhaps late chronologically, but nevertheless fully intending to make up for lost time by promoting voyages of exploration and promoting the idea that England's rightful share of a world commerce and world dominion now awaited in the reconnaissance of North America, what the English at the time viewed through their cultural lens as the remote, heathen, and barbarous lands of North America. According to one English promoter, referring now to the native peoples of North America, they shall have cause both to fear and love us. So again, no talk of freedom here, no talk of liberty. This has very little to do with those modern concepts which we sometimes try to project back into the past, but rather with this idea of dominion. England is coming as a competitor now in the imperial game, a competitor with the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch, to take what it perceives as its rightful share of world commerce and colonization. And so we look here at the map now of North America. You can see the areas in yellow from the southwestern part of what becomes the United States, what is now the United States, all the way down through Central America, South America, and many of the islands here of the Caribbean, including, though, the peninsular mass of Florida, belonging or at least claimed by the Spanish Empire. So England is entering an arena now that is already a crowded neighborhood. The French will be very active, for example, in the Great Lakes region of what is now Canada as well, the St. Lawrence Seaway of Canada. So England is entering a crowded field of imperial competitors, you might say, and starting its project, its own imperial project now here in the region known as the Chesapeake Bay. According to one of the English promoters of this cause, Walter Raleigh, he that commands the sea commands the trade, and that he that is Lord of the trade of the world is Lord of the wealth of the world. And so we'd probably be hard pressed to find a more succinct expression here of English ambition with reference to the Western Hemisphere than that of commanding the trade and commerce of the Atlantic Ocean, competing with her imperial rivals. The English are not in any way focused on the transplantation of modern values of liberty or freedom as we would understand them. This is much more purely a corporate venture, a kind of capitalist venture, wrapped up as it is with English cultural assumptions of greatness and Protestant Christian propriety. In other words, wealthy investors looking for profit. Here's a closer up look at the Chesapeake Bay. Along the Atlantic coastline of North America is the inlet to the Chesapeake Bay, which is essentially the watershed for the rivers coming off the great Appalachian crest here. That is, on the eastern side of the Appalachian crest, as the water flows to the sea through rivers like what the English will come to name the York River and the James River and the Potomac River, the Rappahannock River. Some of these names are Indian names. Some of them are English names. We know them today as part of the American geography, but at the time they were really channels into the unknown for the English, who had so little information. This seemingly had been a region passed over by both the French and by the Spanish, and so the English were taking a great risk financially and in business terms by latching onto here what for them was a rather mysterious region, and a region, by the way, the Chesapeake Bay at the time, that was well inhabited and, politically speaking, controlled by the native peoples who lived and had lived for generations in this area of the Atlantic coast. So not exactly the most promising beginning, but nevertheless, it was in 1606 that wealthy investors in English established what they called the Virginia Company, named after their illustrious Queen Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. The Virgin Queen becomes the Virgin Company or Virginia Company, receiving royal grants to establish plantations in North America. So from the beginning, this is a partnership of the English crown and private investment to develop what they hoped would be lucrative commercial ventures now on a beachhead of North America. And that first settlement, that first barely successful settlement, of course, which will lay claim then to becoming the first permanent English settlement in North America, is the place they called Jamestown. Established in 1607 by the Virginia Company, Jamestown is named for Elizabeth's successor as monarch, King James, and modest though it was, it does in effect become England's first tenuous toehold on the North American continent. There had been other settlements attempted, most famously the Roanoke settlement a bit farther south, but without success. Now, Jamestown itself will survive only by a thread, but nevertheless become then the first tenuous hold on the North American continent. And according to Richard Hakluyt, again, one of the great promoters of English imperial venture, and I say promoters because remember, wealthy English investors had to be persuaded that this was worth their while to support these merchant expeditions overseas to the faraway American lands. And according to Hakluyt, in the promotion of this venture, the basic goals were clear. First, to plant a Christian religion, so giving voice here to the sort of imperial and religious pretensions of the crown to compete with the French Catholics, the Spanish Catholics, in spreading their banner of Christian religion to places far afield. Second on the list, to traffic. And this was simply Elizabethan shorthand for business and trade and commerce. Traffic. And finally, to conquer. That is, in a military sense, again, in imitation of the Spanish Reconquista, that is, the military removal of the Moors from Spain, what we know in a larger sense as the Christian Crusades, to take part now as an expansive military kingdom by asserting both its naval and ultimately its land claims through military force. Now, I think you could just as well turn this list right upside down and start with conquest as number one, trafficking in commerce as number two, and the implantation of Christian religion as number three, because in effect it all hinged on dominion. It all hinged on conquest. Notice what is missing from this list, and even if the list were longer, would be missing, was the thing that Americans always like to claim so somehow fundamental to the beginnings of their nation, that is freedom and liberty. Nowhere will you find these terms as we would understand them on a list of incentives. It's worth noting that the first two English women to arrive in Virginia, the Virginia colony as it will come to be called, came in mid-October the following year after the settlement of Jamestown in 1608 as part of the so-called second supply of colonists. According to the records of the ship's manifest, a Mistress Forrest made the journey with her husband Thomas Forrest, along with their maid, a domestic servant, and Burris. So as a wife and as a servant maid, women from Europe now gain their own toehold, if you will, on the lands of North America. What all of this prefaced, of course, was an almost immediate conflict between the newcomers and the established residents of the Chesapeake, the Native American peoples who had organized and established their own communities, their own governments, their own trade long since in the lands surrounding the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, the Chesapeake was home to some 20,000 Algonquin-speaking native people spread across 160 villages, forming one of the most powerful alliances, fully capable of resisting the English and their conquistador dream. Really, the Algonquin Confederacy, or sometimes called the Powhatan Confederacy of the Chesapeake Bay, was in its own way just as well organized, just as well established, and just as capable of defending itself as the Iroquois Confederacy farther north. And the English would quickly come to understand this, as Jamestown itself barely managed to survive those first years of settlement, and quickly the ability or inability to establish anything like peaceful or profitable relations with local native people was entirely up in the air. The English had really no leverage in the beginning. They brought no particular wealth that they could somehow impart to the native peoples, the Algonquin speaking peoples of the Chesapeake. There was nothing they had by way of trade that somehow the native people wanted. And so it was a very difficult relationship, one that frequently led to conflict as native peoples increasingly resented the pretensions of the English arrivals toward land and resources and just their very presence, really. But this was part of the overall English strategy, remember. It was never again somehow entertained that this process of conquest and dominion would be a peaceful one. And thus, in many respects, the English are at least mentally prepared to see this as a process of violent conquest, not to civilize native people, but to remove them. And again, sometimes we get that confused, I think. We assume that because the English came as pious Protestant Christians, that somehow they were interested in making friends with or converting native peoples. But in the Chesapeake, that had almost no relevance to their plans. It was not a civilizing mission from the English perspective, but one of Indian removal, one of vanquishing native people. Listen to Virginia's governor, early colonial governor, Francis Wyatt. Our first work, he says, is expulsion of the savages to gain the free range of the country for increase of cattle, swine, etc. It is infinitely better to have no heathen among us, who at best were but as thorns in our sides, than to be at peace and league with them. So again, it's hard to make it more plain than Governor Wyatt did here, that there was no serious purpose for the English in either creating alliances or making peace, that is, making friends of native people, but instead to thoroughly uproot and remove them, clearing the way for England's own suite of trade and agricultural and commercial practices. And thus, of course, were the lives of native women going to be very severely affected and disrupted. It was an English artist by the name of John White who will provide us with really priceless records, now documentary records, of Native American life and appearance in this early period of colonial expansion by the English. He was an artist whose watercolor sketches you see here of Native Americans often focused on scenes of daily life, including that of an Algonquin village here in the corner, and of a mother and daughter, a profile, a portrait of a mother and daughter. And as the caption I mentioned shows the young girl holding what looks like an English doll, which suggests that the early settlers made some efforts at trade, of course, with local native peoples, bringing trinkets and English goods to trade in return for food and basic protection if they could negotiate it. But basically, what we're seeing here is a kind of first-person view, and unlike some of the accounts of native people by Europeans, these rather faithfully rendered, I think. No great distortions or misrepresentations. These figures are done in a sort of Renaissance style. of the human form, but nevertheless, White, I think, was attempting a faithful representation of what he saw and those he met among the native peoples. They wear their hair trussed up in a knot, he wrote, as the maiden do, which we spoke of before, and have their skins pounced, meaning tattooed, in the same manner. Those were the initial descriptive comments of Thomas Harriot, another English traveler and newcomer to Virginia, who, even before the arrival of the Jamestown settlement, had been among the first of the English ships to make contact with native people. So Harriot's 1588 description of native women provides us again with a kind of first person testimony, you might say, of the native people who lived in the regions where the English will now arrive. And of course, what the English are bringing is much more than watercolor and written description, along with private property, an entire, as I say, suite of agricultural practices, an entire suite of commercial and trading practices will now be implanted in the settlements, the English settlements of the Chesapeake. Private property and fences, fields and fences, that is surveyed into parcels, bounded by fences, agricultural practices imported from England will now begin to redesign a landscape to which the English were only now becoming accustomed. And of course, the great economic lever of this settlement will be the cash crop market of tobacco, a Native American leafy plant that had for generations been used by native peoples throughout the near Caribbean and North Atlantic coastal regions of North America. That tobacco, a leaf that held what native people believed were curative properties, even medicinal properties, stimulant properties, would now be in effect discovered by the English. That is, would be repackaged, if you will, as a commodity for sale by the English, providing a much needed commercial basis for the continued expansion of English imperial settlement in North America. And part of that demand now for tobacco, that is, as tobacco, smokable tobacco, becomes increasingly popular in London, excuse me, and elsewhere throughout England and Western Europe, that is, as Native American tobacco and the smoking of the leaf becomes a nearly addictive propensity of Europeans, so too then will the demand for a greater supply of what King James called that vile weed, an ability to produce in greater quantity than would require the purchasing of a larger laboring population of people to actually grow this stuff. And it's here we find the intersection of history and women's history in particular taking yet another turn. A sink to drain England of her filth and scum was the rather indecorous description by one Englishman who suggested that two ends could be served, two problems could be solved. Not only could laborers be found, able-bodied laborers be found for the tobacco fields of Virginia, but also England's own social economic crisis of landless, propertyless beggars, that is, of poor country folk who had been dislodged, uprooted by the enclosures of great estates, landed estates in England, who found their way to English towns without prospects of work becoming a drain on the public treasury as debtors' prisons and poorhouses proliferated. The idea that somehow these people could be turned now toward the migration path of North America to be used as laborers in the tobacco fields of Virginia. George Downing wrote a letter to the Honorable John Winthrop, colonial governor of Massachusetts in 1645, saying that, quote, planters who want to make a fortune in the West Indies must procure white slave labor out of England if they want to succeed. What Downing referred to as white slave labor, we would also refer to as indentured labor, that is, poor English folk signing over their lives and fortunes and labor to contracts of service in the tobacco fields of Virginia and the sugar plantations of the West Indies. It was this surplus population of so-called sturdy beggars that offered a labor force and thus lives of women included, who would now become part of a migration of laboring poor to the imperial ventures of the Western Hemisphere. And here again, it's worth noting that nowhere in this matrix of connection is a discernible emphasis on what we would call freedom or liberty. These are desperate times for the poor of England, who feel they have but few alternatives in many cases except to take on the indenture for labor, which essentially meant that you had signed yourself into, as Downing put it, a kind of white slavery. I say white slavery because already by this time the Atlantic slave trade was bringing African people to the Western Hemisphere. But in the English colony of Virginia and Maryland in the Chesapeake, you will see initially not Atlantic slave trading, but rather English indentured servants arriving. Again, under dire circumstances, to live as an indentured servant in the Chesapeake, as we'll see, would be to live a precarious existence, not one of proud freedom or liberty by any stretch of the imagination. A system of indentured servitude using what the English themselves considered, quote, loose and vagrant people to build the first viable plantation economy in British North America. Around 90,000 of England's poorest propertyless English servants will arrive in Virginia over the course of the 1600s or the 17th century. About 90,000 of them, and anywhere from a third to upwards of a half of those coming will now be women. Women's labor was essential to the success of England's colonial venture in the Chesapeake. Laboring in a double sense, that is, in the fields, but also in childbirth, women will become among the most important field laborers, along with domestic servants in the indentured contractual labor world of 17th century Virginia, which meant that they experienced all the harsh conditions of life in North America, living, as the caption suggests, short lives, high mortality rates. This was not a prescription for health, because even if you could manage to survive the rigors of tobacco field labor, you still had to survive the unfamiliar climate, which presented its own problems to the health compared with the climate from which you came. The Chesapeake was a swampy and malarial region, and malaria, mosquito-borne disease, will wreak havoc on the lives of English laborers, inducing, as I say, high mortality rates. And then on top of that, sort of the cultural prohibitions. For example, marriage. English indentured servants were not allowed to freely marry until their terms of contract were fulfilled. And if you, as a woman, had happened to become pregnant during your time as a servant, you could be punished, physically punished for this. So-called tobacco brides, really almost like concubines, were purchased by tobacco field owners, that is, by planters, for the sole purpose of coming to Virginia to take up residence, to be the legal wives, you might say, and eventually to become the mothers of what will be the first generation of English born residents in the New World. This obviously opened up wide avenues for abuse and exploitation, including sexual abuse. There was no defense really for a young woman, either as a tobacco bride or as a indentured servant. There was no recourse for justice, only the hope that you could survive the arduous process of migration and labor, along with all the other dangers of living under these terms. And the English common law principle of femme covert, which said that all property, all legal rights, all political authority belonged to the husband. In fact, that even the wife herself belonged to the husband as a kind of legal entity, meant that women were not going to have anything like the freedom and liberty that we sometimes imagine is the basis for the beginnings of English settlement in the New World. In other words, any way you paint this picture, it's not going to yield that kind of sunny, optimistic view of America being founded on the principles of freedom and religion. And thus, what this made possible was a system of extraordinary exploitation of the labor of poor English people to provide fortunes for the few and hard lives for the many. Here is a sketch diagram drawn from later 17th century Virginia, which showed the rather regal mansions of the wealthy in contrast to the servants' shacks, if you will, the much more modest structures in which the vast majority of the laboring people who made up the laboring, or the majority of the population of Virginia, would have found themselves living. All right, so this will end part one of our discussion of colonial lives. We will move on into part two by looking at the arrival of the other great portion of the population of early colonial English settlement in America, and that being African people, who begin now to take their place in the fabric of North American culture and society.